we are living through historic times, and future generations will look back and wonder, WTF?
This is the Almost Daily ZenCast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and good night to you, dear audience listeners, from wherever you are tuning in from around the world, in the near present tense or in the not-too-distant future. I humbly thank you. Your engagement with my content is deeply appreciated. I am the host of the Almost Daily ZenCast, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Before I dive into whatever I was going to ramble about today, I wanted to address a simple question that I get asked on occasion that I don't think, to my own satisfaction, I've ever really fully answered, at least not on the show. I get asked in different ways by various people, why do you call your podcast the Almost Daily ZenCast if you don't really talk about or discuss Zen that much? There's two primary reasons. One is functional, and the other is, well, they're both functional. One reason has to do with the way ideas appear in my mind, and the other has to do with the realities, or the simple realities of what I'm actually doing. So the most direct way of answering that question, why do I call this podcast the Almost Daily ZenCast, if it isn't specifically, like, if I'm not a Zen guru teaching Zen, right? Which I'm totally not. And I've never pretended to be, for the record, right? To be really, really clear, dear friends, if you're new to the show, never in any way, shape, or form in the 6 years, I think now, maybe more, that I've been doing the podcast, have I ever claimed or in any way, shape, or form insinuated or pretended or misled people to think intentionally that I am some kind of guru, that I am some kind of enlightened one. Never made that claim, no matter how many times I've been accused of it. People will just look at the fact that I discuss things from a transcendental point of view and instantly, immediately jump to the incorrect conclusion that I'm someone that has presumptively declared to the world to have achieved enlightenment. No, thank you. In fact, those of you who know me well enough know already that I argue quite bluntly in the face of many spiritual people, in the face of the trend, the trends going on in spiritual circles, that hardly anyone has achieved enlightenment, in large part to the very technical issue that it is my humble opinion that actual enlightenment would mean the absence of that person from this material realm. But put a pin in that. We've discussed it many times. Back to the question, and then we can go on to discuss some of the historicalness of the moments that we're living through. Why do I call this the Almost Daily ZenCast? In short, because it is my Zen. This is my practice. I'm not pretending to be an authority on the subject. I'm not pretending to teach anyone how to be Zen. But for me, observing the world, meditating on it, and then sharing my concerns as a matter of public discourse, not declarations of belief, but rather an engaging with the public in a discussion, or at least adding my voice to the cacophony of voices, in the sphere of public discourse. Just that, doing it, confronting the stage fright of turning on this microphone and speaking my mind to a global audience. That is part of my Zen practice. It's part of what I need to do to keep myself sane. And that's simply it. I guess the second reason, or the second explanation I can give, is that my ideas come to me. I was about to say my brain works in weird and curious ways. Ideas come to me in ways that I find interesting and weird and mildly unusual. I don't feel like I create my content through personal ego calculations or engineering. Like, I don't calculate the words that I say on this podcast. As I sometimes like to use my catchphrase, this show is real, raw, and radically unscripted. Ideas come at me. I don't craft them. I mean, I do a bit of both. It really depends on the idea and what's going on, but most of the time, one example being when I decided to launch this podcast and was trying to figure out what to call it, ideas just sort of fly at the back of my skull like spaghetti strands being tossed from some dark void in the center of my brain. I'm not really clear as to how it works, why it works the way it does, and all I know how to do is try to catch those ideas and then process them. And all of that is to say, when I first started looking, in my mind for like, what do I call this podcast? The very first phrasing that flew out from the center of the vortex of consciousness, at the core of my being, was the Incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's Almost Daily Podcast. I thought, okay, that works. But I also thought it's like, it's kind of generic, other than it's very on brand. I knew I had to keep the goofy, creative license of hosting a real world social commentary, satire, public discourse podcast in the guise, or under the cosplay pretense of being a fictional character from the book series that I'm writing. And if that's confusing to you, put a pin on it. I've talked about it before, and I'm sure I'll talk about it again. But in short, while I, the very real person behind my crazy ideas, wants to share with the world my very real ideas, I've couched it all as something that is being done by a character in a book series that I'm slowly writing. But in essence, when I got that first draft version of the title, I was like, it's missing something. I had a little something, and then I didn't know what, and I just sort of sat around, and then all of a sudden, it just came back slightly rewritten. The Incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's Almost Daily ZenCast. And I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to run with. And if anybody out there tuning in is disappointed, upset, offended by the fact that I call it the Almost Daily ZenCast, and I don't sit around lecturing about Zen, my humblest apologies. Okay, having said that, I'd like to turn our attention now to just take a moment and sort of acknowledge some of the broad historical things going on in this world after a brief musical break to sort of cleanse the palate. Here is a fresh, hot off the tracks, live to tape improvised performance. No editing, my friends. Just DJ Zed's raw animatronic robot talent on display for you. A remix live Nebula audio asset live to tape remixology loopification digital performance entitled Cosmological Echoes from Beyond. It's a longish track, so I'm just going to tease you a chunk of it. And then we'll return to discussing some of the historicalness of the moment we're living through. To enjoy more of DJ Zed's music without me cutting it off and talking through the end of it, head on over to soundcloud.com/Mr. Zeppo. Thanks, DJ Zed. I was digging the somber grooves there. Rock on. Okay, so let's zoom back a bit. Although I don't quote unquote preach Zen, I definitely speak to the public discourse of our world events from a transcendental perspective. In other words, I'm not a materialist. I'm not someone limited by such notions. I'm also not into the propagation of any kind of dogmatic orthodoxy about belief, right? I'm into phenomenological experience. And some people will instantly understand what that means, and some people will be like, huh? And that's okay. The world, the universe, this quote-unquote place we live in is much more complex and nuanced and subtle and mysterious than most of the trending worldview ideologies give it credit for. Which is why I'm often speaking my mind out against such cosmological models that push for a minimization of the agency that can be seen in the cosmos. I am of the humble opinion, based on phenomena I have experienced, not dogma that I've given my blind faith to, right? It's a distinction that I think is very important to be made. I don't assert and I don't make the claims that I make because I've adhered to some form of ideological construct. I don't think that I'm just regurgitating, right, the talking points that someone has expressed and that I've picked up and decided to give my faith to. While, of course, you can find plenty of sources and writings and philosophers who speak on the subject, and that we can discuss about the statements they've made and whatnot. Beyond those claims made by people that came before us, I am convinced that every human individual has the opportunity immediately within their living circumstances to directly experience the phenomenological evidence, the concrete, undeniable, experiential evidence that life is the cosmos and that the cosmos is life. In other words, that the universe is alive, not a computer simulation. And we've talked about that recently. What does that have to do with history? I think a lot. We romanticize the past. We antagonize our fears and we project our hopes for the future. And yet we always live in this present moment, the eternal now. Not because Buddha said so, not because some other guru put it that way, but because observationally we can confirm this is so. We look back towards our lived experience and with nostalgia, perhaps with shame, perhaps with pride, perhaps with apathy, right? But we have this relationship with all that happened to us before, and it's a relationship that is maintained in our minds. And we also maintain this relationship with what is about to be, with, the next step, the future events that we imagine to be able to foresee, that we anticipate, that we speculatively predict and or foreshadow to ourselves. And those are all useful survival tools, right? Those are all things we've evolved as living, breathing, talking, ambulatory meat sacks of blood and bone, with just enough mind of our own to decide for ourselves what we will and will not cling to. My greatest concern as an observer of human events here on this planet, in this timeline, through this probability waveform function tunnel of rendered perceivable outcomes, I'm convinced that reality is more mercurial than we give it credit for. The reality is more interactive than we give it credit for. Now, of course, the catch-22 of being alive is that we exist in this conflict between duality and non-duality, right? The universe can seem extremely concrete, black and white, yes and no, dead or alive, objective. And simultaneously, we must recognize that even when it feels the most concrete, it is in a simultaneous kind of, it happens all the time, all together, all at once kind of way, incredibly subjective, incredibly mercurial and not concrete and sort of wiggly and topsy-turvy and a little bit all over the place. What am I trying to say? History, right? Back to that key word, history. We are living through historic times. And we may be able to agree on some concrete set of statements that we might conveniently decide all to call facts, such as, the British monarchy is transitioning because of the death of its previous monarch, and going through the ritual motions of celebrating the establishment of the legitimacy of the new monarch. Setting aside whatever thoughts, opinions, concerns, criticisms, critiques you may or may not have about monarchy or the individuals involved, these events are happening, right? And these events are not without their impact on our minds and our experiences and our understanding of the world, right? Similarly, although completely differently, another big historical thing that's part of our current moment is this 21st anniversary of 9/11 here in the United States, as well as a whole cacophony of things going on in the world. These two things are just some of the biggest, shiniest things going on. Let us not ignore or neglect the war in Ukraine, an epic historical phenomena or event or series of events in and of itself, for all the reasons that it is epic and a big deal and historical. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Let's honor and acknowledge the suffering of the people in Pakistan with a record-breaking, truly sort of horrific, almost biblical flood. And I loathe to say that because, we open a can of worms there, but a flood of biblical proportions quite literally, is happening in Pakistan. 1/3 of the nation is flooded. Millions of people displaced. 5 feet of rain, like a record mind-boggling 5 feet of rain in a remarkably brief period. My thoughts and prayers go out to all those who are suffering there and everywhere else in the world, because no matter what day it is, no matter how you slice it, there are countless places where deep suffering is going on. And as I do on occasion, I try to invoke at least the acknowledgement and the honoring of that suffering in this show. Not to be a downer, but to remember, right, that whatever we might be going through, but by the grace of God, there go we else all to some other deeper, sadder place of more profound suffering. Every day is a chapter of the living history that we are living through, that we are participating in creating. Because we aren't just passively suffering through the events of this world. To a certain degree, we facilitate their manifestation, right? Whether we realize it or not, whether we even believe in that or not. Which is why I'm deeply concerned with the propagation of ideological constructs that then shape and form and dictate people's beliefs. Because as I've said before on the show, and I'm sure I'll say again, because it's one of the biggest pins on the board, belief is a powerful tool. It not only shapes and filters and alters and potentially can manipulate our perception as individuals, it also is a creative energy in and of itself that can be harnessed individually and collectively and used either consciously or unconsciously to craft the creation of circumstances and contexts and events in the world around us. When we take agency as individuals, when we choose to question the ideological constructs and examine them and keep or let go of them according to our beliefs and what we feel might be best for ourselves and the world, we participate in a collective phenomena. And therein lies my concern with blind faith, right? When we get wrapped up in blind faith when we get caught up in our blind faith adherence to ideological constructs, we sort of give up our agency, in my opinion. We give up our autonomy to a certain degree. And it fascinates me how, especially here in the United States, how many who are screaming and shouting and foaming at the mouth about freedom and sovereignty and agency and individual liberties are also demanding that others blindly adhere to belief systems that you either believe in this or you're against us all. One of the misunderstandings that I come across, projected at me is people think that I'm denying that powerful people conspire in the world when I criticize and question and point out the flaws in conspiracy theory content. It's quite the opposite. I have never denied that powerful people conspire in the world. People without power conspire in the world. Nearly everyone in the world conspires to do something, right? When you make plans with your friends, you're conspiring, right? We've made so much hoopla of conspiracy, and we've made such a cultural identity out of believing in conspiracy theory that we've lost the nuance of understanding that conspiracy theory content is just as likely to be a tool of manipulation as any sort of declaration of liberating truth. And some people would be shocked by that statement because either they radically deny conspiracy theory content entirely, or they blindly believe conspiracy theory content is absolute truth and cannot understand that it might conceivably be a tool being used against them. We are living through historic times, friends, and our public discourse about our experiences living through this historic times will be left in a very disorganized, semi-permanent record of our online social discourse. And future historians, arguably aided by mega super powerful thinking computers, advanced beyond our powers of imagination to even conceive of right now, are going to look back and go, what the bloody hell were they thinking? Why? Why do I feel that way? Because despite the fact that we are living, arguably, in a height of technological advancement and a time where information is more readily available than it almost ever has been, we seem to be, as a collective, capable of just ignoring all that or taking it for granted at any rate and continuing to behave in essentially barbaric and mind-bogglingly primitive ways. Future historians will look back and wonder why we spent so much time arguing and fighting about engineered, wedge-issued treadmills of argumentation, which are easily identified as engineered wedge issues of argumentation, treadmills of keeping you busy arguing, instead of solving the problems being dangled in front of us like carrots to keep running on those treadmills. And as you may have noticed, my emphasis is in abdicating our addiction to arguing about the problems so that we can see the problems more clearly, identify real world workable, functional solutions to those problems, and actually implement them as a collective for the benefit of the entire human species. I don't pretend to know what all the solutions are. Never have. I do think, quite humbly, that we would be better positioned to actually solve the problems if we acknowledged, admitted, opened up, and just, called ourselves out as a species about these ideological, imaginary, man-made divisive issues. Instead of just pointing fingers and saying, y'all being divisive, there's nothing more tragic and mildly funny. Like, it's a tragic comedy here in from my perspective, that in the United States, the population is split down these ideological divides, and across every imaginable division, we have these groups of people pointing fingers at the other group of people saying, it's you guys. You are all demented and deluded and misled and manipulated. When both parties are running on a treadmill of argumentation and distraction, a wedge-issue treadmill system. It's a double-barrel echo chamber of echo chambers, as I've said before, and I'm sure I will undoubtedly say again. And I think that anybody and everybody has it within them to liberate themselves from any and all ideological constructs they may be clinging to. Now, you can't liberate someone else. You can help. You can show them the door, as the ancient Buddhist saying goes, but you can't push them through it. But showing them the door is better than judging them and mocking them and ridiculing them and just pointing fingers and accusing them of things that may or may not be remotely accurate or helpful to point out. And that's a fine line, because to a certain degree we have to rattle the cage a little bit for the mind to realize that it is clinging to a cage. But the mind also needs boundaries, right? The way our minds work, we require them. We want them. We feel safe and comfortable with them. Ideologies are not implicitly evil. In fact, I have yet to see anything that is implicitly evil that isn't a made-up cartoon figure of something that we fear, right? Vampires, implicitly evil. Okay. They don't exist, though. The devil, pure evil. Okay, but does he really exist, though? Lots of people be claiming that he does, but my lived experience, and I don't pretend to be an expert, my lived experience as a spiritual seeker, as a questioner of all things, and as someone willing to set aside my own beliefs in order to engage with, the reality around me as it is. All of that has led me to the cumulative set of experiences that lead me to the conclusion that which we vilify as evil is the trauma, is caused by, it originates from the trauma within ourselves that we refuse to attend to, both individually and collectively. No human individual, even the worst human individual, and you can think of all kinds of examples from sick sociopathic murderers to criminals of all kinds. The worst examples of vile people if you look at them clearly, without preconceived moral constructs by which to judge them, you can see that they are still humans, still people, and most often people deeply traumatized by pain and suffering that has gone long neglected. And my lifetime of experience has led me to conclude that this is true of all of us. Even the best of the best people, or even the people who think themselves the most virtuous and pure, are not. Now, I know that it's controversial, but there's a bit of religious dogma that seems to correlate here, and that's that concept of original sin. Now, this rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and trust me, it was one of the first things that I started to question way back in the day when I was being raised inside of an organized religion and being taught its dogma and being asked to invest my power of belief into its ideological constructs. I don't think that, like I was saying, I don't think that any human individual is pure evil. I think that every human individual that has ever lived has the capacity to become, to give into, to succumb to the corruptive powers of this deeply neglected spiritual trauma that is the root source of our inappropriate or quote-unquote bad behavior. No one is born full of hate. And all one needs to do to confirm this is witness the true innocence and undeniable simplicity of, the divine gift that is life in its infancy. Evil is a lot of things because we've characterized it as a lot of things. Evil is a word we've created to represent all that which we fear, that we loathe, that we disapprove of, that we do not wish to endure. But we've created a false dichotomy. We've created a false paradigm of belief that they are evil over there. Insert your favorite villains, your favorite bad guys, your favorite people to judge and kick to the curb. And that we are virtuous over here. And this false paradox has not only been allowed to propagate, it's being used against us on many levels and in many ways. And we are being guided towards the vilification of others. As opposed to, not guided, we're being herded, right? We're being shoved down a chute of blindering ideological constructs and absolutist paradigms about how to judge the world and the people around us. But the irony is that by doing so, we debase ourselves. The more we engage in this us versus them behavior, this us versus them thinking, this us versus them reactionary, accusatory mentality of they're the bad ones and we over here, we're the victims, we're innocent and pure. The more we risk becoming that which we are persecuting. I've talked about this before in the podcast, so there's already pins on the corkboard. And I hope you do seek those episodes out. But let me steer myself towards a winding up of this episodes and suggest that the more we fixate on the evilness of others, real or imagined, the more we endanger ourselves, the more we risk falling into the ego traps that seduce us into becoming as evil as that which we vilify. In all the darkest moments of history, right? Why were the evil people evil? What was their rationale? What was their excuse? That those other people over there are pure evil, and that we over here are virtuous and true. Therefore, we must destroy those people. And that, dear friends, let me be very clear, in my mind, is a kind of madness. A kind of madness that makes us as evil as those that we are vilifying. And I think that whatever powerful people or groups of people in the world are out there trying to profit, no, not just profit, but profiteer. And if you don't know the difference, I humbly recommend you get a dictionary, because there is a huge difference, right? That's why I corrected myself. There are greedy, corrupt individuals and groups that would love to profiteer even harder on the human species. And to that end, they will spew manipulative content that declares itself to be the absolute truth, that demands blind allegiance and unquestioned faith, and that is completely rooted, anchored, fixated in the vilification of some other group, the self-adulation of the us group, and the invitation of an antagonistic relationship between those two groups. An invocation of antagonism. Because they're the bad guys and we're the good guys, and we have to be at each other's throats. And I say, no. I say no. No, we don't. There is one human genome propagating an infinite array of copies of itself. At the center of every one of the billions of cells in your body that are yours and not a colony of other life forms, colonizing your body apparatus or your body cavities. At the center of every human cell is a genome that is incomprehensibly communicating with its component genome in every other cell, and that literally displays in its own structures the lineage of how it all spirals back into one singularity. The sacred geometric mathematics involved is quite stunning. The fact that the genetic structures of the thing that makes us what we are indicates that it's all interconnected, right? And that sacred geometric mathematics applies at every level of analysis, from the largest structures in the visible cosmos to the very engines that create life deep within every cell. It's all a facet of a multifaceted, fractal geometric, holographic system of manifesting, of unfolding and creating a reality. Now that sounds like some crazy talk, right? Especially to someone who's deeply nested in the comfort of a materialistic worldview that denies anything more complicated than its fundamental materialist understanding of the world. Now, I'm not categorically denying or trying to debunk materialism. I think to the very limits of its own boundaries, it does indeed accurately describe the external material, observable universe. But it fails to describe the very real, very tangible aspects of the universe that reside on the other side of the liminal spaces of the external material observable goings on around us. Materialism in and of itself, until it holistically incorporates non-materialist observations about the world, will never fully answer the mysteries of the world. Not by itself. We must transcend those boundaries and integrate the knowledge and understanding and wisdom that we can garner from other ways of observing the universe beyond that of the materialist lens. And of course, this brings us to, the mysteries of life, the soul, the mind, our very phenomena of being aware of ourselves and these bodies that we inhabit, while simultaneously being completely mystified by how they work. Right? The significance of history is one way of cataloging our experiences as a collective, right? The landscape, the topography of historical events. But it is a narrative. It is a verbal narrative that we create for ourselves to codify what is, in real life, a chaotic, tumultuous, and sort of never-ending and quite foamy, to throw in a weird descriptor, quite bubbly and very complicated set of interconnected phenomena. As many a Zen thinker has pointed out throughout the time that Zen has been around to talk about Zen, the words are not the things. They just help us to think about the things. But we get really fixated on the words. And we argue about the words instead of communing with the thing or the phenomena or the experience. Right? We argue about the shape of the world instead of connecting to its energy. We argue about the validity of this political idea or that political idea instead of communing with one another to solve the problems that we've created for ourselves. We fight about political parties instead of feeding those who are hungry and clothing those who don't have clothes and housing those who are unhoused, right? Now, some of that debate about ideology, about party, about politics, about policy must be had, because we must question and analyze and assess things at every possible level. But what I'm all about here on this podcast is humbly encouraging anyone and everyone willing to hear me out to experiment for themselves with the additional process of, beyond the scope of just arguing about the words, beyond the scope of just saying, hey, I disagree with you about this observation. Some of which is valid, some of which isn't, right? Like, we can argue about how we perceive the world. We can argue about how we interpret the world. We can argue about how we want to politicize the world. We can argue about how we want to shape the world with our ideologies, I mean, we can argue about all the things we can argue about till the proverbial cows come home. Or we can heal the trauma, the latent, deep-rooted trauma in ourselves as individuals, which we may or may not be aware of, which we may or may not be actively neglecting or dismissing or denying. But that is clearly there because it's observable at the species-wide level. If the species as a collective whole is suffering from deep spiritual trauma, then it makes perfect sense to me that must mean each of us as individuals are carrying some portion of that burden. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we feel it or not, whether we realize it or not, right? Just like each of us carries genetic information that we may or may not understand how it functions, but that regulates every activity of our body. From the way our hair grows out of our skull to, well, not our skull, but the scalp on our skull, to the color of our eyes, to the height and proportions of this ambulatory meat sack that we scooter around on this material dimension, in this material dimension. I could be wrong. I could be totally way off base, and I'm always one to acknowledge that as part of my public discourse. So, please, dear audience, never believe that I blindly believe that I have some absolute truth. I don't. But I also refuse to blindly believe in any other claim of absolute truth. For all the reasons that I've discussed before on the show and that I'm sure I'll discuss again. Call me a cynic, but if there is any absolute truth out there in the world, I think it might be that the only absolute truth is that there is no absolute truth. As one ancient mystic put it in some beautifully written thing whose name I don't remember, every truth is but half-truth. Because all things are part of paradoxes. Now, I'm not talking about ideological truth. I'm talking about empirical truth, about cosmological truth, about natural, organic, universal truth, which is, of course, where we point to when we try to argue about ideological truth, about a man-made mental construct. We try to attach it to some kind of universal truth. But the interesting thing is, if an ideological truth, if a man-made ideological construct is not true, but enough people choose to believe in it, it will appear quite truthy. Just ask the Flat Earth community. Right? Just ask any community that implicitly and unironically prides itself in its blind faith adherence to some structure, some dogma, some statement, some article of faith, some thing they believe in. I don't think that we'll find any solutions to the problems we've created for ourselves by fighting about those things that people have chosen to believe. Belief is sort of this catch-22 double-edged sword. It's simultaneously powerful and kind of pointless, right? And forgive me for picking on the flat earthers, but it's the perfect example. It's kind of pointless that that any given individual believes in a flat earth model. Let's say, for example, I were to believe in a flat earth model and just blindly adhere to it and demand that everyone else... It's kind of pointless, right? Like, it won't change the reality that the world itself isn't flat. I mean, it just won't. But it will dramatically impact how I perceive the world around me, how I interpret the world around me, and how I judge the world around me. And the harder I cling to the ideological construct that the world is flat, the more I will perceive it as being flat. Conversely, I mean, a flat earther could make the exact same argument about a globist ideological construct, right? And for those of you who are long-term listeners, you know where I stand. I am not a globist. Just like I'm not a leftist or a rightist. Right? I'm not even a transcendentalist, but for a lack of a better term, that is arguably what I am. I don't want the left to destroy the right. I definitely don't want the right to destroy the left. I want everyone on both sides of the ideological divide, on every quadrant of the spectrum of political ideology, to transcend the structures of man-made political ideology. I don't want the flat earthers to perpetuate flat earthiness and convince more people that the world is flat. But nor do I want the materialist globists to sit back and rest on their laurels and perpetuate a materialist globalist globe shape ideology, because I think both paradigms are flawed and missing key ingredients, key descriptors, key aspects in their model, that deny a reality that is perceivable. And that's that whatever shape Mother Earth may or may not have, she is alive. There's a pin on the corkboard about that. I've done full episodes about it. And of course, it's a theme that's cropped up throughout the show. Now that seems to some like an absurd thing to say. But now imagine an argument going on inside the human body by some of its colonizing, microbial life forms. A war going on in your gut biome, where all the little critters that live in your lower intestinal tract are debating whether or not planet human, as they may curiously, comedically call it, if we were to personify them and give them English language and discuss them as if they were little cartoon characters. Can you imagine if the, what are those things that live in your gut called? The probiotic, all those little, there's whole different colonies of living life forms that are not human, that are important and integral to the human body's functioning. Can you imagine if they were waging a war inside of your body over whether or not you were alive? if you could, you would want to reach down there into their plane of awareness and be like, quit it, yo. This bullshit war you're fighting is tearing up my insides. And if I die, you will not have a hospitable environment to continue living in. Well, forgive me for personifying the planet a wee bit, but it is alive. And if it is alive, it might very well, in its own way, at its own scale of grandeur and enormousness that we can't even begin to comprehend, be deeply problematically worried and or upset at us for tearing the shit out of it, for waging wars, and consuming and commodifying its blood and bones, and effectively destroying it to the point where we, its children, can no longer gestate in its womb. Because if there's one spiritual way that we can, one spiritual model or idea or notion that we can wrap our brains around, it's that this Mother Earth, this grand divine matrix, because the matrix is not some... Everyone's using the word matrix wrong in this postmodern societal trendiness of memeified communications. Like we're out there arguing about the matrix of man-made ideological constructs, which grammatically is a correct way of describing it. Sure, it's a functional way of describing it, but the true original meaning of the term matrix is the living divine mother womb. And let that sit there for a minute so it can sink in real good. We are gestating in a living environment that is as much the body of a sentient being as our own body is a planet, quote unquote, for other life forms to live on, to live in, to live within, to reside as inhabitant life forms within us. And just like we would not appreciate those life forms ripping our flesh and bones apart to commodify them for the meaningless pursuit of imaginary wealth, because material wealth is purely nonsense. It's a system we made up with our imaginations, and our imaginations are not inherently evil, as some teachings of throughout history from religious organizations have tried to indoctrinate us into thinking. But they're not inherently, free of problematic issues either. Just like we would not want the living organisms that colonize our body to destroy our body for profiteering's sake, we should recognize that Mother Nature, Mother Earth, the great divine womb matrix creatrix that is gestating us here in this mysterious living biome, does not appreciate us ripping her apart for the purposes of pursuing the imaginary ego-driven bullshit of wealth and power. And so, we can get swept up in arguing and discussing and debating the details and the nuanced, fascinatingly weird things going on in the world around us, right? From honoring the passing of monarchs, remembering the tragedies, the deaths of thousands of people in, questionable events from 21 years ago, to honoring the suffering of millions of people in the, climactic tragedies that we ourselves are making worse. We must, I think, at all times answer the call, the spiritual call that echoes throughout all of our consciousnesses to heal, right? To heal ourselves, to heal each other, to heal the human species, so that we may fix the problems that we created for ourselves, so that we may provide for each other that which we artificially made scarce, so that we may transcend these paradigms of self-destructive behaviors, so that future historians may look back at this period in history and not wonder, what the were they thinking? And instead be like, and this is when people went, aha! And had a eureka moment of discovery, of self-discovery, of self-awareness, of realizing that within our own minds, we have a wealth of subtle, nuanced phenomena that are as important, if not more so, than any of the things that we could engage ourselves, busy ourselves with in the mundane material world and the society that we've built on that mundane material paradigm of the world. Perhaps this is why I didn't feel comfortable doing a podcast episode over the weekend after dropping that Morbius review. Because the double whammy of the anniversary of this controversial event here in the United States and the historic passing of an arguably controversial individual across the pond, I didn't really want to talk to those things. I didn't want to address those things specifically, and it felt like if I did a podcast, especially yesterday, I would have had to really focus on those things, out of respect for the moment. But those things are complex, and what am I trying to say? These two events, as different and weird as they may be from one another, and yet how curiously interconnected they may appear to be to others, to some, depending on what ideological constructs or conspiracy theory constructs they may be clinging to. These events take their toll. These events can't be denied, right? No matter what you think about monarchy, this transition is happening. And it is impacting, it is having an effect on millions of people. No matter what you think about the tragic events from 21 years ago here in the United States on September 11th, those deaths and, the very event itself has had an impact on people, one way or the other, over the last 21 years. And we can either fight about them, argue about our theories surrounding them or about these events, or we can attend to the grief and the mourning and the healing necessary in order to transcend. And I don't use that word lightly, friends. I know I use it a lot, but I think that is the very calling that we have here. If there's anything we are invited to do, it is to live our lives, experience the wealth of phenomena available to us, examine ourselves, not just on a materialistic plane, but on a means of thinking, but in a spiritual way, not an organized religious way, but in a spiritual way. And even spirituality is bogged down with the same sort of dogmatic problems as organized religion, and I recognize that. But there is, there's religion, and then there's the ecstasy of divine phenomena. There's spirituality, and then there is the undeniable spiritual experiences that can be repeated and personally verified. And that's the place where I come back to, right? We can argue about stuff that we can't quite prove for generations. And I'm intrigued by, as an author, as an aspiring author, a writer of future sci-fi, futuristic sci-fi and sort of, what am I trying to say? I'm fascinated by the possibilities, right, that may come about if we, as individuals and as a collective, choose to set aside the argumentations and explore these subtle, mysterious, magical experiences that are, according to those who have experienced them, available to anyone and everyone if they just open the door that's being pointed to. Don't take my word for it, right? I'm not here demanding anyone's belief. Said it before and I'll say it again. I don't want you to believe what I say. I don't want you to believe in me. Just like I don't believe in the moon. She's just up there in the sky doing what she does, right? I want anyone and everyone that might tune in and listen to this podcast to entertain. What was that quote I read earlier? It's the sign of a mature mind to entertain an idea without completely accepting it, right? I want you to explore the ideas that I'm sharing, not swallow them hook, line, and sinker and never question them, right? My challenge to any and all listeners is the open letter of love and compassion that I'm writing to the world, to the human species, can be essentially summarized as dear fellow human life forms, dear fellow living beings. Can we set aside our differences, both real and imaginary, and focus on our commonalities? Can we set aside our rivalries, both real and imagined, to focus on our organic, unifying oneness? Can we focus on, can we look beyond the things that separate us and focus on the phenomena that indicate We are already one with one another. Is that too much to ask? Because I think that healing the human species, I think that healing ourselves so that we can help each other heal is more important than engaging in political argumentation, and more effective than getting swept up in participation in political, ideological argumentation. I don't know about you, but a review of history that has brought us to this historic moment clearly indicates to me, and I think some others out there too, I'm not the only one who feels this way, that our historical track record shows that we are, unfortunately, like we're addicted to this proclivity to try and solve our differences through violence. The human species seems to return again and again to violence as a tool. But what has it truly solved? I ask over and over and over again. And people will say, and I understand the perspective of, especially from a personal perspective of, without violence, such and such event would have happened to me. Without me choosing violence, such and such individual would have done, have committed violence against me. I understand that. Violence can end a situation, right? Can put an end to a dangerous threat. I'm not saying that violence doesn't have its usefulness. I recognize that. If someone's going to come at me, I'm going to have to put up a defense, right? If someone's going to lunge at me, I'm going to have to make my choices. But when I say that, that violence has never solved a problem, I mean in the collective aggregate of our historic experience. War after war after war. And what's going on? We're on the precipice of yet another global war, possibly. There's a lot been said about the centuries-long tradition being lived out right now, right? As our friends across the sea mourn the loss of their previous chosen monarch, and celebrate the recognition of this passing on of a quote-unquote hereditary and supposedly divinely chosen responsibility or burden, this mantle of being sovereign of a political empire. And it's all quite quaint nowadays, right? Now, I mean no disrespect. I send my condolences to the British people and to the members of the Commonwealth that take this seriously. I also acknowledge and send my respect to all those who have grown up within that system and have chosen to speak out against it, right? Because while I send my condolences to those who feel that they are in mourning, I am in no way, shape, or form politically defending the problematic issues of monarchy at large or individually speaking here. But what I am trying to drive at is, why do we have these, why does this nation or any nation have these traditions? Because their ancestors literally used to butcher each other over territorial claims, right? It's why we're fascinated by shows and entertainments like Game of Thrones, The Crown, and both real world historically inspired stories of the struggle for these positions of power, or fantasy, the flights of fantasy based on these ancient tribalistic episodes of using violence in order to bring about peace. And with all due respect to these centuries-old traditions, I'm glad that there is no longer the normalization of brutal, bloody, mortal, deadly violence, right, in our society. Although we still struggle with acts of violence daily, right? It's one of the biggest problems in our postmodern world is that everywhere you look, there's violence. But at least we aren't slashing each other's guts open with swords at the drop of a hat. I'm reminded of a scene from the most recent episode of not Game of Thrones, but House of the Dragons, or whatever it's called. Game of Thrones, House of Dragons. There's that scene where whatever her name is, the main female character, I cannot remember for the life of me what she is called, but she's the princess due to be the queen, upon the moment of her father's death. And she's sitting there receiving a collection of potential suitors. And this young prepubescent boy is presented to her by one kingdom, one house of power. And she's, of course, not interested, and just as she was not interested in the previous suitor who was, as she pointed out, older than her father. But the thing that I'm thinking of, or the imagery that I'm reminded of, is as she's leaving, this 15, 16-year-old boy, maybe 14, maybe 13, I don't know how old he's supposed to be, they don't say, gets into a verbal argument with some other, I guess, would-be suitor sitting around in court, and they draw steel. And this kid guts this older young man for words and honor. Was a problem solved? No. Someone's life was taken because words were exchanged. Now, it's easy to agree that, that's a high fantasy show about a completely fictional world where, steel and dragons are the tools of power. But it's not that distant from our lived experience now. There's this shocking case out of, I think, Sacramento, where a politician, a Democrat, and I'll admit to you, when I first heard the headline, I thought, oh my gosh, are Republican politicians just living out the Trump statement that they can shoot people down in the street and get away with it? And of course, turned out it was a Democrat. But two wings, one bird, my friend. Put a pin in that if you haven't already on the corkboard. But this politician apparently, obviously must be presumed innocent until proven guilty. But apparently this politician, like something out of the Wild West, just shot a journalist down for words written. Was that justifiable? I don't know. I didn't read the articles written by this journalist, and I don't know the specificities and the details of this politician's platform, or this politician's real life history, or this politician's, skeletons in his closet, his sins, his failings, his problematic issues. I don't know them. What I do know is that it's crazy to me that a politician from any party would pull a gun on a journalist in this land of freedom where free speech reigns supreme and shoot them down like it was the wild, wild west. Yet here we are, friends. Did that violence solve any problem? No, it just created more. Created more grief, more sorrow, more suffering, and, more potential for revenge down the line. And that's just one crazy example. Obviously, it ranges from individual acts of violence like that to this ongoing war that, according to the perpetrators who instigated it, would be a 3-day military maneuver going on like the 7th month, 8th month now. And that's a whole controversial issue, right? Pin on the corkboard, already discussed it, talked about where I stand on who I support and why. But regardless of supporting the underdog, the apparent victims of invasion here, and of course there's plenty of reasons why people out there are arguing contrary to that position, but bottom line, when it's all said and done, parents will be mourning the loss of their children on both sides. And no real problems will have been solved. And I don't pretend to know. I'm not the kind of person running around, claiming to have the capacity to make predictions. But I will call out patterns when I see them, right? And this is a sad, dark, ancient human pattern that, instead of transcending our differences and solving the problems that we ourselves create for our own future generations, we have a tendency to lean in towards violence and just end the people and or circumstances that are considered unacceptable. But whilst ending one aggression with violence may feel good, it only sets up the rationale for other aggressions. An eye for an eye will leave the entire world blind, as some wise person said once. And of course, the greatest tragic irony of most of the world's historic violence is that it's been, in one way, shape, or form or another, done under the pretense of some sort of divine proclamation, right? From the conflict between Israel and Palestine to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have leaders claiming righteous spiritual authority, waging war in the name of God, or inciting violence in the name of God. Which, as one of my favorite statements of all time likes to point out, this is humanity's greatest absurdity, right? I forget the dude's name. Hold on. Let me see if I can dig up this meme so that I don't flounder around and totally misquote it and fail to give credit where credit is due. I have a copy of this meme somewhere here in my giant and completely disorganized pile of memes. Boom. Hubert Reeves, a Canadian-French astrophysicist, and I quote, "Man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, unaware that this nature he is destroying is the God that he is worshiping." And that includes ourselves and each other. For we as individuals, no matter how much we may feel separate from nature, we are not. We only have this imagined delusion that separates us from nature. Right? Just like the seed comes out of the fruit, which comes out of the blossom, which comes out of the branch, which comes out of the trunk of the tree, which comes out of the what do you call it? The sprout, sprouting forth from the seed, which comes from where? The inside of the fruit, which comes from out of the blossom, which comes out of the branch of the tree comes out of the pit of the seed. It's just endless, fractal, recursive, spiraling genesis of life. God is not some cartoon character asshole demanding that we butcher each other in his name. That is pure ego. That is pure ideological, imaginary, made-up nonsense that only benefits those who profiteer on violence and war and conflict. The calling has always been there to look within and transcend these ideological divides that keep us at each other's throats. It's always been there. And it will remain there, beckoning to us as individuals and as a species collective to set aside the made-up nonsense that keeps us stabbing each other in the eye, so that instead we can put down these tools of self-destruction and pick up the tangible, physical, and spiritual tools of self-healing. Not because I said so, not because Hubert Reeves says so, not because this guy or that woman or this priest or that rabbi, not because any person says so, but because the universe itself is trying to give birth to us. And the more we destroy ourselves in the womb, the more we destroy the very womb that is gestating us, the more we destroy the very environment that gives us life. The further and further away we will push ourselves from achieving that which everybody seems to want. I don't know a person in the world, even the supposedly evil bad guys, that when asked doesn't say they just want to live their lives in peace and harmony with their families and enjoy themselves and prosper, right? Take a survey and ask humanity, what do they want for the world? Peace, love, harmony. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there that are cranks and will troll that question for sure. And there are people out there bound up in their anger and their ideologically driven hate for other members of this family, this species, which we are all a part of, that will answer that question in some really dark and vile ways. But deep down, beyond the rationale for attacking others, is this notion of deserving peace. It's the linchpin that holds together the hyper-vilification of others. You, us, we are true and virtuous and worthy of living in peace. Therefore, we must judge and hate these other people and blame them for the absence of peace. That's madness to me. And I call it out as such. Not because I think I know better, but because my experience engaging with the divine mysteries of reality itself have led me to conclude that, we're doing this all wrong, right? We're just bashing our heads against a brick wall and insisting that everyone else join us in bashing our heads against a brick wall. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world, and I'm sort of talking in broad terms, in transcendent terms, in terms that don't directly address the minutia. And I do that on purpose because I think that the minutia is sort of the slippery slope that pulls us in towards the ego traps. Yes, the devil's in the details, but what's the devil doing there? Besides being an imagined fear-mongery, scare-puppety figure of our own mind, of our own creation, and of our own, that is a part of ourselves. There's a lot of people, especially here in the United States, caught up in the fear-mongering that the devil is some evil thing out there in the world that's out to destroy us, that's out to dominate us, that's out to punish us or make us suffer. But my lived experience has led me to the conclusion that there is no such external being. There is no such demon. That this is all this image, right, of a horned and behooved, red-skinned monstrosity is a creation of our own minds. It is a personification of an aspect of ourselves that we fear to address and contend with directly. As one wise person seems to have put it a while back, which has been memeified, there is no God or Satan in an objective sense, right? And I'm totally interpreting the statement in my own wording. There is no God or Satan in an objective sense. These are symbols of different aspects of our consciousness, of our spiritual inner workings. God is our highest consciousness, and Satan is our lowest form of consciousness. And we must integrate the two. We must heal the illusions and the barriers and the boundaries and the lies and the ideological constructs that we cling to, and set them down so that we may transcend the false narratives that keep us trapped in these self-destructive behaviors, so that we may bring about the manifestation of deep spiritual healing for ourselves and each other. And this is not just for all the good ones. This is not just something a privilege for some elite group of people that are more special than others. That's a load of malarkey. That's just more us versus them division making. And, who did Jesus heal? The lowest of the low. The most vilified of that society. Right? If we really want to change the world, I think one of the toughest pills to swallow that we all must choke down is that we are every bit as much responsible for the evil we see in the world as those that we point our fingers towards. And that if we're going to take responsibility for that, our course of action, that would actually solve the perceived problems, that would actually elevate everyone into a healthier place of being, of operating, of existing, is to heal ourselves and each other, and most poignantly, those we have deigned to be considered evil. Those we have declared are the bad guys. Why are they bad? Why are they evil? Because they're suffering the worst of the spiritual trauma, and that's causing them to behave and act out in the darkest and most inhumane of ways. And if we only chase after them in antagonism and in anger and in hatred with the goal to destroy them, how do we even pretend to claim to call ourselves the good guys? If we choose to lower ourselves to the same hateful place as those who are the supposed bad guys, what do we become? As I've said before, and I'll say it again, because I'm very much morally opposed to the death penalty and to the idea that killing each other solves problems. If we murder a murderer, do we not become murderers ourselves? And of course, there's a lot of practical issues that get in the way. I acknowledged earlier, like self-defense is self-defense, right? I'm not talking about... A lot of people their immediate counter argument is, oh, so if someone's coming at you with a knife or a gun or a thing, you're just going to let them kill you? I mean, that is what Jesus did. Isn't it? And that's my first... Whenever a self-declared Christian comes at me with that kind of rationale, that's my first response. Especially if they're that kind of like Rambo Jesus brand Christian. I really don't get that. There are Christians out there literally saying, he wouldn't have been crucified if he had been born today because he would have had military-style weapons of mass destruction to protect himself with. Bullshit. You're clearly missing the point of that whole parable. The whole point of that story is that he said, lay down your swords, dear army of followers, and melt them down into plowshares. And let the Romans take me, for I will let them crucify me. But let's not get into a whole discussion about that. I don't pretend to be an expert in Christian dogma or ideology. I am someone who just keeps questioning when Christian authorities present to me a dogma or ideology and demand that I agree with them that it is absolute truth. That's a whole nother discussion. I don't think we're here to constantly destroy each other, to butch each other over and over and over again like some sort of Westworld loop of violence. These violent delights will have violent ends, dear friends. If there's any profound truth coming out of that beautiful piece of entertainment art, It's that, right? The more we lean into violence, especially in the name of the very divine thing that we claim to understand, in the name of the divine powers that give birth to us in the first place, I think the more we will just destroy ourselves more completely. The more we will succeed in destroying this living biome that provides for us. And that's a frightening thought. One that I think can be prevented. An outcome that can be a probability waveform function tunnel we can avoid barreling down. Like that meme, that car meme of that, like, whatever that car is, like peeling out off the off-ramp like they almost missed it. We can keep going down the path of self-destruction, or we can, like, make a hard turn on the off-ramp of self-liberation and self-healing and transcendence. And I'd prefer it if we'd start, but it seems like we're just peeling out in circles trying to destroy ourselves. And holy moly, have I been rambling for quite a bit of time. Let's put a pin on all of those loose strands of thought that may or may not be dangling, and come back to them at another point. As always, friends, I thank you for tuning in. I thank you for joining me for this discourse, and I invite your feedback. Please head on over to solo.to/Mr. Zappo to find all my social medias and all the ways in which you can engage with the discourse presented in this particular line of content, as well as all the other content that I'm slowly working on to be shared and discussed. And now for a bit of DJ Zed music to cleanse the palate and bring us to a close here. Remembering the Forgotten Funk. DJ Zed performing a G-House Volume 2 Remix Live entertainment audio asset package for your entertainment. Sure to check out the SoundCloud playlist of DJ Zed's most recent music. Tune in, sign up, and get ready go and enjoy the summer hiatus playlists as these last few dog days of summer wrap up. And then brace yourselves as we will be dropping a whole new playlist of fresh, hot, new, never before played tracks for, the time of seasonal change as we brace ourselves for what I'm sure will be a very strange and bizarre winter. I wanted to close on a final bit of thought that I had while I was listening to the music, and that's this. I've long struggled with the duality of truth, that we speak about truth in absolute terms, and yet we can only perceive truth in relative terms, right? The statement that this group or that group has the absolute truth has always rubbed me the wrong way and forced me to ask questions. But so has the statement that every individual has the divine light of truth within. And here's the catch. Here's what I think the fundamental flaw, the mistake that we make, the flaw inherent with any discussion about truth is that for most people, they fixate on the words. And they create fantasies and ideas and ideologies about what truth is and then present those words as the truth. Perhaps because, for centuries, we have had this association, thanks to organized religion, with words and truth and divinity. Now, there's some interesting problematic issues there, not the least of which is that the words of the texts of our organized religions have often been changed, manipulated, corrupted, dare I say. For example, the very issue, and I made a whole episode about this before, but in most of the places in the Bible where contemporary translations use the word as in God's word, right? The original Aramaic and other languages were actually referencing logos. Go check out my episodes entitled Logos for more on that. But essentially, what I'm trying to say here as a closing thought is, of course there is truth. And that truth is not the language that we use to describe it. Those are just symbols. And we need to start there with our hang-ups about the truth, because people want to fight about the words. My collection of words is the truth, and your collection of words cannot possibly be the truth, all caps. But that's not how truth works. The sun shining, before we describe it, that's the truth. That is an absolute truth. The sun is up there. And it's not even absolute, because any deep study of its mechanisms will show you that it, like many of its predecessors, will ultimately extinguish through its own organic processes, right? It will transition into some other state of being. The truth is not the language, nor the words, nor the symbols that we use to depict the truth to each other. So arguing about words is nonsense, in my opinion. Arguing about whose interpretive dance depicting truth is the most accurate is malarkey. Arguing about whose written text is closest to the absolute truth is a fool's errand, because the words are never the thing. The word tree is not the growing miracle that we can pick the fruit from, right? The word fruit is not the sustaining food that we can put in our mouths and digest in our bodies. They're just symbols pointing towards those things so that we can discuss them with our sentence-making, jibber-jabbery mouths and the mechanisms inside our head that are rooted in the use of language. Truth is beyond language, if I might be so bold as to say. So any any ideological language-based argumentation or declarations about the truth are inherently limited and flawed, even in their purest sense. So even when someone is speaking the truth, they're only speaking language that describes the truth. And the truth is somewhere else, transcending the language itself. And if we could all wrap our brains around that, we can then, I think, begin to set down these inherited ideological arguments about whose truth is the truthiest truth. Because the truth is life itself, not our descriptions of how we think life works or how we believe life ought to be. Of course, the catch-22 is that belief endows language with the power of being believed in. And of course, it's something we've talked about before in the show, and we'll talk about again, not just in this episode, but in many others. I'm going to stop rambling at you. Thank you so much for being here, friends. Thank you for tuning in. If you appreciate what I'm doing and you would like to explore more of the content, not all of which is this serious and heavy-handed as the podcast, by all means, head on over to solo.to/Mr. Zeppo. Please be advised, my collection of content creating platforms spans the breadth and range of, stand-up comedy to high fantasy fiction, science fiction, and everything in between. So don't conflate it or confuse it all as some sort of declaration of absolute truth. All right, friends. I look forward to joining with you again in some future episode to discuss and contemplate these complex and fascinating things we call our daily lives. I think I may take a little bit of hiatus from the podcast the rest of this week to focus on some other things, as I have been lagging behind my own desired output in terms of content creation in the different dimensions of the Zeppoverse. But I will be back again soon enough.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily ZenCast, with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.
People might giggle at that little tagline, but I take that shit serious.